India win.
He'll come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series.
They're going to get back for two. India at home. Lords goes wild.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the 81 All Out podcast. I'm Siddhartha Vaidyanathan at Sidvi on Twitter, and I'm thrilled to have with me someone I've known for close to 2 decades now, the brilliant author and journalist, Samanth Subramanian. Hi, Samanth. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Sid. Good to be here.
Thank you. And Samanth has been a journalist for close to 20 years now, I guess, and he's written 3 wonderful books, all of which I'll link in the show notes. His most recent book is a terrific biography of JBS Haldane, who, if you want to know who JBS Haldane is, I'll just say that both JBS Haldane and Samanth are 2 people who appear to be people who know everything. So the polymaths, or Polymath has written a book on another polymath. So you should follow Samanth at Samanth_S on Twitter. And there you can see all of his latest stories and also sign up for his newsletter, which he's just about to launch in a little while. So, Samanth, can we start off with the chat?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. So, let me just give a brief preamble to this by saying that, I always classify cricket writing and writing on cricket into 2 broad categories. The first category is people who cover cricket on a daily basis, the beat journalists, the reporters, the editors, and they are fully focused in the cricketing space. And then you have the other category, people like Samanth, who come in from the outside to write on cricket, often from time to time, not as regularly as the beat reporters and journalists, but there are bloggers, hobbyists, and again, as I said, journalists like Samanth. We've had a lot of mainstream cricket writers on the show. We've had Fidel Fernando from Cricinfo, Vijay Lokapalli, Sharda Ugra. But I thought it'd be great to hear from someone from the outside as well, because somebody like Samanth comes in with a fresh pair of eyes each time into cricket, and it brings in a very good touch to the cricketing discourse. So, Samanth, let's go back a bit. You told me something very interesting recently, which I had no idea about, that you were first introduced to cricket probably slightly later than many others, maybe when you were in high school or something?
Much later. Yeah. I mean, the thing that happened was we were living in Delhi in the 80s, and I had a very, very sort of fleeting experience of cricket at that time. We used to play it sometimes, but I never used to follow it at all. In fact, I think the only match I remember watching during that time at all was some snippets of a one-day international in which Gavaskar and Chetan Sharma put on a huge opening partnership against New Zealand. Now, I can't for the life of me recall what match this was. In my memory, I vaguely have Gavaskar scoring 100. So was this his only one-day 100? I'm not sure. Anyway, so that was the only game that I remember watching on black and white TV and so on. But then we moved out of India. And for the next 4 or 5 years, while we were overseas, while people like Sachin Tendulkar were storming the scene and so on, I just had no contact with the game at all. So we returned to India, to Madras in 1995. And, this was sort of a year before the World Cup. This was when Sachin had already sort of been established as a huge talent. And that was really the start of my introduction into cricket. And at that time, I was, 14 years old. And, initially, I didn't think I needed to follow cricket. I thought I could sort of be perfectly fine in a school where everybody else seemed to be obsessed with the game. And, I would just be not one of those people. But it's impossible, I think, to not get sucked into it, especially if you are, or if you were a boy in school in the 90s. It's impossible to not get sucked into it and be as fascinated with the game as everybody else. So the first time, I was telling you a couple of days ago, the first time I heard of Tendulkar was during or just before the World Cup. I even remember, in fact, the first time I ever saw him on TV, Sid. This was a game, I can't remember which game it was, but that little sort of player statistics box came up below his image as he walked out to bat. And I remember the statistics still that was imprinted on my mind from then. That his best score was a score of 115 against New Zealand at Baroda at the time. So that is my first glimpse of Sachin, really. And the World Cup came around, and as you and your colleagues put it so beautifully in your 1996 World Cup episode, it was impossible to just like not get sucked into it, heart and soul. So that was really how I fell into cricket in the first place.
So when you saw Sachin Tendulkar for the first time on TV, you'd probably heard a hell of a lot about him, right? From either classmates or friends or maybe even your parents if they were following cricket.
My parents were not huge cricket followers. They became sort of at least cricket watchers after I started watching more of it. But yes, my friends definitely. I mean, you couldn't step into a group of boys in India at that time without hearing Sachin's name in the first 10 or 15 minutes, right? It was impossible. I'd heard about, and it was interesting because in the sense of a national ownership of Sachin, that had already happened, So all these friends of mine who admired him, I felt like they already sort of possessed him, knew him inside out. He already meant so much to their lives, and I was sort of starting from zero. This whole concept that you talked about, sort of coming to cricket as an outsider, as a writer, you can trace it back to then as well. I was coming to cricket as an outsider, as even an admirer or a fan or a cricket watcher. And certainly I was coming to Sachin as somebody who had not known him at all, whereas all these kids, these boys had sort of grown up with him, so to speak. They had seen him almost since 89 or 90 on television, and had seen him grow to the talent that he was in 1996.
They had seen him when he didn't open the innings.
They had seen him when he didn't open the innings, and they'd seen him when he first started opening the innings. I don't know if they saw that New Zealand match in New Zealand live or anything of the sort, but they definitely had seen him after that. And so by the time we came to 1996, Sachin was like a fully established, fully fleshed out, rooted figure in the mythologies and imaginations of all of these people. And I had to start building that up from scratch for myself.
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting the way you say talk about the ownership. I mean, I lived in Bombay and, as you know, worked there. We were colleagues even there for a short while with Cricinfo. But when I used to speak to people in Bombay, a lot of them used to, whenever the talk of Gavaskar came up, they used to call him Sunil, at least the people in the cricket writing sphere and people in the cricketing sphere. But you go around India, generally you first hear Gavaskar. So, I mean, if you, especially in Bangalore and Chennai, when they're talking about him, they always say Gavaskar. They may say Sunil Gavaskar, but they'll say Gavaskar. Now, with Sachin, though, the first name almost was pan-Indian. Everywhere in India, people just picked up Sachin. It's not like, of course, they'll say Tendulkar, but there was this, a large number of people just took to Sachin and referring to him as Sachin, and even do now.
Because in our minds, Tendulkar is still 16 years old making his test debut, right? I mean, that's he is still a boy. And he is still to be referred to fondly as Sachin, this little boy, short-statured, chubby face, babyish features, slightly squeaky voice. I mean, all of this goes towards the boyhoodness of Tendulkar as it is. And so even though he's 40 or past it now, I mean, he is still Sachin to all of us. I mean, I'm in my late 30s, so neither Sachin nor I are boys anymore. But he is always going to be Sachin to me, even when he's 80 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us about, you've spoken about your introduction and the time you saw Sachin and all these people speaking, but tell us about your introduction to reading about the game and where were the primary sources? I mean, I guess the daily newspaper must have been one, but were there any other sources, any books that had a big influence on you? I mean, cricket books.
Yeah, I mean, so the Hindu sports pages and Sports Star obviously were like my two primary sort of drugs. The Hindu at the time had an excellent sports page. R. Mohan was still writing. They used to do these lavish, I don't know if you remember this, they used to do these scorecards that were not the kind of, run-on things you have now. It used to be like a layout, like a graphic table almost, where you would have runs and balls and sixes and fours and all of this stuff. Really sort of beautiful graphic right in the middle of the match report. And you would have all these magnificent writers writing. Mohan's prose was so good at that time, I remember. I mean, I forget all of that. Even the ads for Sports Star that used to be in the Hindu were excellent. I mean, that was the kind of creativity and care that went into cricket, covering cricket in the 90s. I think there was one where Australia was touring India. I remember, and they had the two War brothers on the cover of Sports Star, and the ad for that issue of Sports Star in the Hindu, the tagline was, "The War brothers. If one of them has an upset stomach, the other gets the runs." You know, stellar. I mean, like amazing tagline. See, I still remember that vividly. So anyway, so these two, of course, I would subscribe to Sportstar, would come home, and I would get like everybody did, I would get the pull-out poster in the middle and sort of, treasure those. And then slowly I started reading books around cricket. I think one really seminal book that came out sometime in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken, is that Picador Book of Indian Cricket, edited by Ram Guha.
Yeah.
Was that the 90s?
It might have been early 2000, but I'm not sure. Maybe
Early
late
2000s,
90s
yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Something like that, yeah. So I remember that coming out, and I remember I just like devoured that book and then devoured it all over again. From there, I knew so many other writers to pursue to read. So, for example, I read Cardus in that first, and then I went out to read Cardus elsewhere. N.S. Ramaswamy, who has a beautiful piece, so witty and funny and elegant in that book. I tried to find other writings of his. Even things like Fingleton and so on. A lot of these authors were introduced to me for the first time when I read them in a Ram Guha column, or when I read them in a Sports Star column or in the Hindu. So, and then I would try to seek out those books as far as possible. I remember when I was at college, 99 onwards in the US, the library was huge there, 3 million books, and they had a ton of books on cricket. So I checked out The Art of Cricket by Don Bradman and a bunch of other books that I'd only heard of until then. And these guys had a stash of that. So that was how slowly sort of, my interest in how cricket could be used as an avenue for interesting writing. That's how it started.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think a couple of other writers have also mentioned this Picador Book of Cricket in both our podcasts as well as in other interviews. And just tells you how just one book like that with such variety of writing, and it can open a youngster's mind like no other. I mean, it's, reading the Hindu and the Sports Star gives you one view into cricket, but reading a book like this, it just almost makes you believe that you can do anything with cricket.
That's the thing. I mean, it was sort of meta writing, right? It was, of course, there were a lot of pieces in that were just beautiful reports about play on a particular day. But there was also sort of the bigger picture. There were some social angles. There were sort of musings on the game. There was wit, and there was, you found that cricket allowed you in a way that perhaps other sports don't do. And I know there'll be plenty of other people who disagree about this, but I think other sports don't quite allow you that kind of latitude for literature that cricket does. I was on a panel once with the writer Joseph O'Neill, who wrote Netherland, that novel about cricket in New York. And, we were tasked to talk about how the novelistic equivalent in cricket is Test cricket. Test cricket is, cricket's equivalent of the novel in literature. And we really found sort of, I mean, it was a tenuous topic to begin with, but we found a lot of similarities. How, for example, little moments in a game of cricket can make a huge impact on a final decision. How things can change over time. The passage of time over 5 days or even 1 day in a one-day match is of tremendous significance. And these ultimate sort of character studies that come out of it. And there were a lot of those in the Picador book as well. You could just sort of analyze a personality or a person based on how he played the game. At that time, it was only a he, the Picador book. And you could really build them out into fully fleshed characters that was such delight to read about. And I think that was something I learned in the late 90s and early 2000s and really wanted to do myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll definitely give a link to that. And if any of you can pick up the hard copy of that book, please do. I mean, of course, it's great. It's probably even available in an e-version, but I would recommend picking up the hard copy because there's something.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a beautiful book. I mean, the paper is beautiful.
Yeah, very, very well edited and well put together. But just stepping back, I mean, going back slightly back to the mid 90s, let's talk about that World Cup. I mean, you did bring up the World Cup, but, as we discussed on the podcast as well, it's one of the World Cups that has not, we felt, hasn't got its fair share, partly because it did receive some criticism about all the commercial aspects that came in. And it was one of the first World Cups that was just brazenly commercial. I mean, of course, you're starting with the with the sponsors and that the cola wars that happened in that time and all that. But I mean, for many of us in India, especially many of us of a certain age, it was magic.
Oh my God, it was formative. I mean, it's like one of the defining experiences of my life. I mean, it changed my life. Literally, it changed my life in the sense that it took me into cricket journalism, and I think '96 had everything to do with that. It was, I read it. So much of your episode on that show, on that World Cup, resonated with me. This sort of asking neighbors for scores outside the school, running home as soon as the school day was over. I used to bicycle home, so it would take 10 minutes to go home, and then like immediately plonking yourself in front of the TV for the remainder of the day. I remember the '96 semi-final in Calcutta, where again we had heard, just as school left, we had heard that Jayasuriya and Kaluwitharana were already out. By the time I got home, De Silva was out. I missed his 66 or 40 balls. So a lot of the things you talked about, I think, were like a universal experience. So there was a real sort of formation of a particular kind of cricket community, I think, among boys of that age who all underwent the same experience. And it was, I remember, as you all rightly pointed out, I remember moments of that World Cup much more vividly than anything I've seen ever since. Even things I've covered live. I covered cricket live from a stadium for Cricinfo several times, and I don't remember moments in those matches as vividly as 1996.
Yeah, and also it's probably around that time that your Sri Lankan cricket love started, right? I mean, I have read a few pieces of yours and also
absolutely
about how Sri Lanka and the cricket and the characters of Sri Lankan cricket, the way they played, it just captured your imagination.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can sort of psychoanalyze this a little bit and come to the very obvious conclusion that in 1996, I was an outsider to cricket. I was just coming in for the first time. And so it was only natural that I would gravitate towards the team that seemed like the other outsiders in cricket who were suddenly sort of, catching everybody's eye, which was Sri Lanka. I mean, nobody owned Sri Lanka in that sense, right? Among my friends who were watching cricket, people owned Tendulkar, and people knew more about India and its cricket history than I could ever hope to learn. But Sri Lanka was new, and it was fresh for all of us. And so I felt, this was the team to back. And it was frankly very difficult not to gravitate towards that team in 1996, I think, because they played aggressively and yet practically. They sort of had a great idea of what their limitations were and what their strengths were. They had a really smart captain in Ranatunga. They had Jayasuriya, who was for years after that my favorite player in world cricket, and we can come to that. And they had De Silva and Murali and these outsized talents like these two people as well. So I mean, it was very difficult to not, especially if you are of the kind of person who always sort of wants an underdog to win. Sri Lanka was a classic underdog in that World Cup, and it was impossible not to want to support them.
Yeah, I mean, let's actually get to Jayasuriya, because in the Cricket Monthly, which is a magazine of ESPN Cricinfo, we started this series called Hate to Love, where you pick a player who you hated to love. And I eventually ended up picking Wasim Akram, but I was very, very close to picking Sanath Jayasuriya, because he was a guy who got on my nerves. Because
why was that?
He was so good. Because he was so good. And, I again, remember, I was somebody who had seen Sri Lanka well before 96, right? So I had seen Sri Lanka, the hapless team, who were getting beaten by everyone. And then suddenly in 96, this guy comes. And then he's relentless. I mean, to the extent of scoring that triple century in Colombo.
Yeah, my God. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and he was a phenomenal batsman. And I think, off late, he often gets bracketed as this, maverick who came in and who just did this something in one-day cricket. But he was a phenomenal test batsman too. He played some mind-blowing innings, double hundreds and triple hundred. So, but tell me, what was it about Jayasuriya that, I mean, I probably know, but you should talk about what, really drew you to him as well.
Well, I mean, I was not alone in being completely entranced by how he played in the 1996 World Cup, right? I mean, there were, he caught everybody's imagination then with the kind of explosive batting that he brought to the top of the order, and just a kind of devil-may-care attitude. I mean, obviously he had been emboldened by Ranatunga to go up and not care about, seeing out the new ball or whatever nonsense opening batsmen were doing at the time, and just sort of go for it. So he had that support, but also he did actually, convert that into very, very fast batting. And the thing that also struck me about Jayasuriya was, he was not supremely talented. I think he was not. I mean, he was obviously not Lara or a Sachin, but he was not even the kind of. He was not a, let's say, a Markwa. I mean, it wasn't sort of that. It never looked like the batting just sort of oozed out of his pores with any kind of grace or ease or whatever. I mean, his short arm jabs were sometimes kind of ugly to watch, very effective. His hoiks over mid wicket were, you could really see the effort that was going into it. He hit the ball very hard, not like Markwa again. So, it seemed very obvious, I think, that he was a player of some talent who was translating that into a whole lot more. And I have always had sort of a weak spot for players like that. I mean, and of course, the fact that he could also, he had this limited but effective bowling for one-dayers, the fact that he was good in the field, extremely good in the field, all of these things suggested to me a player of some talent who was managing to do so much more with it. And that kind of player always attracts me. I mean, for the same reason, in the 90s, I was a huge fan of Michael Bevan, especially in one-dayers, right? I mean, the fact that he would always be put down the order, he was always asked to finish, and he would almost always do the job for Australia. But he was not, an outsized talent in any way. He was just somebody who knew how to do a lot with the little that he was given, or the moderate amount of talent and skill that he was given.
Yeah, I mean, the word that comes to mind when I think of Jayasuriya is audacity. I mean, it was almost like he read all the conventional things that you do in cricket, and he just did the exact opposite. So
right.
That 1998, there was this famous test in England, right? When Sri Lanka went and won that test in England with Murali taking all those wickets. Yeah, no,
this was a one-off test, right, at the Oval.
One-off test when Murali, I think, took 16, if I'm not mistaken.
It was a nuts. He just went mad, I think, and he took 9 in the second, I believe.
Yeah, 9 in the second. He almost took 10. If not, he could have got 10.
Yeah.
But there was this, basically England batted, and then they had this really good last wicket stand. And, those are the things that are pretty frustrating for an opposition. You had this number 11 hanging in there and all that. And England put a pretty decent total. The first ball of the innings that Sanath Jayasuriya faces goes for 6 over square leg. And you're like, holy crap, what is this now?
Yeah.
So
the other thing that strikes me also is that, I've been thinking about this question of sort of aesthetics in cricket, right? So, for example, to enjoy Brian Lara or Markwa at the crease, is that something that you enjoy without knowing anything about cricket? Can you start enjoying that from day one as soon as you're introduced to the sport? I think that's probably not true. I think it's a kind of learned, cultivated thing that you learn from other people. You absorb by osmosis about what is a beautiful cover drive, what is sort of a, not a great, sort of a slightly ugly shot, that kind of thing. So that aesthetic, the appreciation for that aesthetic was not there in me in 1996, I feel, when the World Cup was going on. So I didn't, to me, beautiful batting, quote unquote, didn't matter. Otherwise, I would have gravitated much more towards Lara in that World Cup, or Markwa. So bereft of that, the only metric I had for gauging how exciting a batsman was to me on the screen was sort of excitement. It was adrenaline, and Jayasuriya provided so much of that.
Yeah, you wrote a piece, in fact, I think, which I couldn't find online, for the New Indian Express, where you said you and your friend once heard a Jayasuriya innings. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we mentioned this, I think, on chat, but I'm not sure actually now which innings you are even referring to.
You were talking about how Jayasurya was basically going nuts in some match, and you and your friend were on the phone, and you were basically just so excited about just talking about what Jayasurya was doing.
It sounds very possible because I remember there was another incident when I was researching following fish actually, Sivi. I was in Bangalore. I was in this woman's kitchen where she was showing me how to make fish curry, Bangalore fish curry, the quintessential thing. So I was in the kitchen for about maybe 45 minutes talking to her and kind of watching her make this curry. And in the background, in the living room, somebody was watching a Sri Lanka match where Jayasuriya was going nuts. And my half a year was sort of 1 year was sort of tuned to that score. And one eye was sort of focused on her doing this.
I think you write about it in the book as well, right?
I think so. I think I say. Yeah. I think I say it in the book. Yeah.
Yes, I remember that. I remember clearly a Jayasuriya reference in that Mangalore. Yeah. Okay, now I get it. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So awesome. So, but let's just sort of. So, apart from Jayasuriya, was there anyone else at that time who you sort of could classify as a favorite cricketer, one of your favorite cricketers?
Well, as I said, a lot of these people who seem to do a lot with a little, right? So Bevan, I used to, really admire. I think he was sort of, before Dhoni, he was the original finisher, I think, in one-day cricket and limited overs cricket. I hugely admired Vaughan and Mushtaq Ahmed at the time. Two people who, to me, sort of seemed to just wreak complete magic on the field. I mean, leg spin seemed to be this arcane art that nobody even understood in the first place. Certainly all my friends, I remember, whatever little cricket we played, whether it was in, maidans near our house or whether it was on terraces with plastic balls and so on, everybody seemed to be an off spinner. This leg spin seemed to be something that nobody could properly master at all. And so to see Mushtaq and Vaughan both bowl in that same era was something magical. I'm trying to think. And of course, eventually I did obviously come around to Sachin as well, because it's impossible not to be drawn to him as a magnet in the 90s. And once you start factoring in innings like Desert Storm and so on, it's he was a center of gravity for cricket at that time.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned about the aesthetics, I think it also has to do with you yourself playing the game. And I think once you start playing the game, then your respect for certain cricketers automatically goes up more, because you realize how difficult it is with what they do. Like a Brian Lara, for instance, I remember, how much ever I tried to imitate him in those street cricket matches, it's just impossible. Like, you can't bat like that and get away with it. But he did, and he did it so well. So I think that also plays a part in it. And I'm not surprised that once you started playing, then slowly you also came around to the other great cricketers.
Yeah, although I think, you are definitely a couple of levels above me in terms of proficiency at that age, because I was just basically trying not to get out. I was not a very good cricketer at all. And so forget imitating Lara and all that. I was just, making sure that the ball didn't hit the wicket. So, and we played a very limited form of the game. I definitely did anyway. We used to play on one terrace with a plastic ball, where if you hit the far wall on one bounce, it was a 4, and if you hit it out of the terrace at all, you were out. So that was, I think, the one kind of cricket that I played quite a bit. And then the second one was also, of course, like, outside our apartment where the cars were parked and so on, we would play tennis ball cricket, where you could only hit straight. There was no width in that little passage at all. So, it should have turned me into a magnificent straight driver or whatever, but that also was not the case. But I did sort of spend hours just bowling to myself with a tennis ball, trying to figure out how to make the ball spin. That was something that I think the more I did of that, the more I grew to admire Vaughan and even Murli, actually. I forgot Murli completely in all of this. But Vaughan and Murli, these two wizards with the ball, I think were people who I admired well into the 21st century.
Absolutely. And also, I think, I guess, growing up in Chennai in the late 90s or any time, I guess, it's impossible to not be sucked into cricket, right? Any cricket. There's cricket talk everywhere you go. And I'm just thinking of a situation where you grew up, far removed from a city and maybe in a place with not much cricketing history. But Chennai, you were pretty much at the heart of cricket.
Yeah. They don't call us the knowledgeable Chennai crowd for nothing.
Well, we're talking late 90s, and 99 was when they stood up to applaud the Pakistan team. So,
That's right. And that was a match that I was at, which it was, I think, during exam time for us in school, because 99 was when we wrote our 12th standard board exams. So I think there must have been some kind of preparatory exam or something. So I went for 2 days of that and then had to watch. So I think I watched Ramesh make his debut in that test match, Saragopan Ramesh. But I did not see, unfortunately, the magnificent Sachin innings I had to see from home.
yeah, I think that was the also little quirk of fate, because the Chennai was actually initially supposed to host the second test, but then the miscreants dug up the pitch in Delhi, so Chennai was then given the first test. So had it been the second test, you might have got to see all 5 days then.
No, I think I would still have had. I mean, you know what schools are like, no, in India. So if it's your 12th standard, right from January, they start with practice exams and it doesn't let up until April or whatever it is. So I'm sure there would have been some exam or the other. It was a huge thing that I even got to go for 2 days, I think, in that particular test. And then, of course, I was there. Was it which was the other series where Gavin Robertson
98
was?
Yeah.
98. So I saw that in Australia, the Australia play in Chennai in that test match. And that was good. That I went, I think, for 2 or 3 days, and I saw Sachin play one, and I saw Sidhu play one, which was excellent.
Yeah, and you saw that Sachin innings then, that Sachin 100 rather. Yeah,
I saw that Sachin 100, and then I have a very, back in the day, contacting a cricketer could be, of course, it was not as easy as Sharda calling Imran Khan and asking to speak to him as she mentioned in her episode. But I remember we were sitting at a friend's house, and we had found out that the Australian team was staying at the Taj, one of the Tajes. And so I'd gone to the test match that day and I'd seen Healy, hit a 90 odd kind of score. So I came back and we were sitting in my friend's house that evening and we found out that he was at the Taj. So I said, would it be funny if we just called up and tried to put on an Australian accent and just asked to speak to him? So they said, no, you should do it. And so I called and I obviously did a really poor Australian accent but the receptionist probably didn't know any better. I said, I'm calling from the Australian consulate and I want to speak to Ian Healy and so on. So they put me through to his room, Sid. And I spoke to Healy on the phone for some 4 minutes, telling him that, I was at the game. I continued for some completely unwise reason. I continued with my Australian accent. And said I was with the embassy there is no embassy in Chennai. He would have known this. Anyway, so I said I was with the embassy in Chennai. And, congratulated him on his knock and then hung up. I mean, it was 4 minutes of speaking to Healy on the phone in completely surreal circumstances.
Well, okay, so it's not too far away from the Imran Khan thing. So, I mean, the profile of the cricketer is lower, but it's still quite bizarre.
That's true. Basically, I think the thing that the Taj needs to learn from all of us is don't put people through to cricketers' rooms.
No, yeah, exactly. I mean, and now I'm sure, at least I'm assuming things are different. But back then, I guess, had you told me the story, say, in 2003 or 2004, I don't know if I'll be as surprised, but now I'm definitely very surprised. So.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
So moving on then to, you did, was this in probably late 90s or early 2000s when you decided to go into cricket? You joined Cricinfo and you became a cricket journalist. Tell us about that transition. How did that work? And what was was it just something that you felt, was following your passion, or what was it?
So I studied journalism. I studied journalism in the US, and halfway through my degree, I decided, look, I mean, the ideal thing here would be to combine these two things that I clearly love doing. One is sort of reading and writing, and the other thing is watching cricket. And I had, as I said, I mean, by this time I already had all these examples of wonderful cricket writing in front of me. Things that I had read, and there seemed to be no better life for me than to do that for the rest of my career. And so after I finished my degree, I came back and I really wanted to do that. I tried to apply to the Hindu sports desk and was turned down. I never got a call back, and it seemed to be much harder then, to actually start this career of mine that I had outlined for myself in my head already. And so I was kind of reluctantly, I was in Madras again, and I sort of half took a job with Sun TV. Sun TV at the time, and it was not a sports job at all. It was completely the opposite. It was sitting on the desk and looking at sort of wire reports that came in and fashioning those wire reports into reports that the newsreader would read on television. So it was a really, really sort of dull, dead-end job. I wasn't looking forward to it at all. But I said yes. But before I started the job, I randomly found out online that Cricinfo had an office in Madras, which for all those years I did not know. I thought they must have been based in Bombay or somewhere else. And not only was it an office, it was the head office back then. And so I didn't see, it's not like they were advertising positions or whatever, but I walked into that office and I said, look, I really want to work here. And the receptionist didn't know what to do with me. So she passed me on to the Ramesh, who was the COO at the time, I think. And I was set a test, Sid. There was a 1.5 hour test where some of it was cricket knowledge, but then some of it was also edit these sentences. And some of it was, this is a scorecard, write a short report based on this. There was an actual exam to get into Cricinfo, and I did this. And then they hired me as a sub-editor. And it was, it was such a great day because I could, first of all, tell Sun TV I was not going to come there to work for them. But then secondly, also, I was despairing of doing any cricket journalism at all then. And suddenly here I am working for this website that, as we had discussed earlier, I had used for years already. In fact, when I was in the US, Cricinfo was my primary resource to check scores, to read reports, to indulge all these sort of obsessions of mine, cricket related. And I couldn't believe that I just vaulted, in my mind at least, I had vaulted to the very top of the field by working for Cricinfo. It was a great day.
So yeah, I mean, I think the 2 years you were in the US, or was it a year and a half, or was it 2 years?
2 years, 2 years.
Yeah, the 2 years that you were in the US, I mean, that would have been your oxygen, right? I mean, for cricket back home, especially then, where there was absolutely no other. There was Rediff, but other than that, there was nothing else that could give you cricket scores and info.
Nothing. I mean, the one blessing was that during the 2001 series when Australia toured India, DD for some reason decided to try its hand at streaming cricket live online. And they did this on DD's own website. There was like a small matchbox size, I kid you not. If you wanted to have any kind of resolution to that image, the only way to do it was to see this matchbox sized image in the middle of the screen, in the middle of an otherwise black screen. Because if you enlarge that screen, you would just lose everything. It would just be pixels. And so I would sit up at night and watch this. That's how I watched Lakshman's 281 on a matchbox size thing in the middle of the night, alone in a computer lab somewhere on the Penn State campus.
Well, you would be amazed that a few weeks ago, we had a couple of guys on this podcast telling us exactly, and one guy told us exactly this, how he was on a IT, offsite in the US at that time, and how he went to work every night to watch this particular stream, and then he went back home early in the morning, had a shower, and then would come to work. So this seems to be an experience.
Yeah, God bless whichever forward-thinking person at DD back then in 2001 decided to try their hand at live streaming a match. It was not an unqualified success, but at least it enabled me to see some aspects of that superb series.
Wow, fantastic. So yeah, and so once you got into Cricinfo, tell us about that. I mean, back then Cricinfo would have had a completely different vibe. I mean, I was there from 2003, and of course I was in Mumbai. But tell us about the vibe of the office in Chennai and your memories from that time, and your learning curve in general.
So 2000, when I joined in 2001, Cricinfo was still an independent company. It had not been bought over by Wisden. And it was still, I think, the roots to its sort of tech hacky kind of origins, where it grew out of Rec.Sport and then MIRC chat channels and so on. I think that those roots were still there. They were still quite strong. Some of the people in the office, in fact, were people who were with Cricinfo from the very beginning, Badri Seshadri, who was there. So it still felt like a startup, even though it wasn't technically. It felt like partly like a tech shop and partly like an editorial thing, because they were still developing all these tools to score and have databases and so on in an accessible way. We were still scoring with the help of, we were doing this ball by ball commentary that everybody's familiar with on Cricinfo, and we were still using this set of commands that seemed at the time utterly unintuitive. You had to learn them by heart, so it was almost like you were coding these things into the scorecard. And but it seemed like a really happy marriage of cricket geeks and tech geeks. I think those 2 years that I spent mostly in Madras, but then also in Bombay after Wisden bought Cricinfo, I think they were really, really happy years, and I was very sad to leave. I did all these things that I had wanted to do. I did ball by ball commentary. I did I went to cover Ranji Trophy matches, but I also went to cover test matches. I went to Hong Kong to cover the Hong Kong cricket sixes. And you had the kind of at that time you were still cricket journalism was not the kind of dog eat dog bite happy and thing that it has since grown into. It was still a relatively more relaxed affair where match reports mattered, and people did come and sort of read the commentary because matches weren't always available on TV. Getting an interview with a player was still a possibility of some kind rather than the sheer improbability that it is now for most journalists. So it was a really relaxed time to be there, and I learned a lot from other journalists who I would meet. Both in Cricinfo and then later in Wisden, I would from other newspapers. It was a good community of people, and I think a lot of these people have been on your show. Clayton, for example, who I met in Bombay. He has been on your show. I think I met Vijay Lokapalli once as well, or a couple of times. So it was a fine community of people to be in as you were going through your first job.
And it was also a time when you also must have experienced this, just like I did, when you realized that the players, the administrators, and many others were reliant on Cricinfo for the ball-by-ball coverage and the scores and the Ranji Trophy updates. And it made you feel like you were doing something important.
Absolutely. I mean, you felt like you were part of the most vital resource in the game itself. To the extent that the game, as you said, people, administrators, players, officials would consult Cricinfo and its database. They would look up the match reports. There would be cricketers who wanted to come and write guest columns for Cricinfo because that was the most read resource in their own community. So I did things like ghost wrote columns for Srikanth and so on. These were, it was really, I can't think of a comparable. Maybe it's sort of like in the print world, maybe it's sort of like working at Wisden, at the Almanac itself, where, it is the one resource that is at the core of the community and the sport. But this was very much like that. And I think ball by ball, in fact, I think there were, for example, we had wagon wheels and so on. I think maybe even before a lot of the teams started using them, right? It was a very rough kind of wagon wheel. I mean, I think we divided the ground into 6 broad segments. And when you scored a run, you had to also score the segment of the ground into which it was scored.
Yeah.
Now, it was, as I said, very rough and not at all fine-grained in any way. But we were able to present wagon wheels and so on well before newspapers were doing it, and maybe even before teams started using that kind of sophisticated information.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, I don't know how I didn't burst out in the middle, but ghostwriting columns for Srikanth seems like the ultimate job anyone anywhere can have.
I'm wondering whether I should tell the story. The one story that I always tell from this. I don't think Srikanth listens to this. Let me just tell it.
You have to come on.
Ghostwriting a column for Srikanth involved calling him up the morning after a game, because this was a West Indies series, I remember. So the day's play would have ended at 3 a.m. in West Indies, in India time, and then you would call him at 7 or 8 or 9, and you would just talk to him on the phone for sort of 5 minutes, and he would give you some points, and then you had to sit down and put those points into an 800-word story, his observations and so on. And, it wasn't always clear that he had watched the game because these were night games, and I don't know if everybody was sort of up and awake at 3 o'clock watching the final session of the day and so on. So at most times it was a tenuous affair. He would not really talk for that long. But there was one instance when I called him. I think it was around 8:39. I could hear in the background that he was doing some sort of puja.
Okay.
You could hear the bells and so on. So he was clearly occupied with this, but he had told me to call then, so I called. And in Tamil, he said, uh, I didn't really watch too much. Just put down whatever you think is good. Say that so and so batted well because he had seen the scorecard. Say so and so batted well, and it will be a tough day's play tomorrow or whatever. Some very obvious things just dispensed to me in 35 seconds or 40 seconds, and that was it. I had nothing more to go on. So for some reason, that really irked me. And I wrote this column, but I wrote this column in a way that Srikanth could or would never have written it, with references to Hamlet and P.G. Wodehouse, and sort of really florid language, extremely sort of a very literary column that Srikanth is not known for writing or speaking in that way. It was just me acting out and being a stubborn young ass. But I decided this is what I was going to do. I was very annoyed, and so I wrote this column, and it went out on the website, and things were okay. But then 2 days later, I got an email from a random reader saying, we're all aware that columns are ghost written and things like that, and so obviously we're willing to suspend our disbelief while we read these columns, but surely there's a thing as pushing it too far, and clearly this was not written by him and so on. So I made it extremely obvious when I wrote that column, but in that little fit of petulance, I decided, okay, this is how I was going to write it.
How dare he do a puja while he has to give you some content?
I mean, ghostwriting a column is fine, but you have to at least tell me something about what he is supposed to be watching and analyzing.
Well, yeah, I've heard stories. I won't take names here, but I've heard stories of players telling journalists, when a journalist has approached them for an interview, to say, you just make up the questions and the answers. It's okay. You know what I'm going to say.
My God, yeah, it was. I mean, yeah. Anyway, it was all an experience, I have to say.
Okay, fantastic. So, but one thing about Cricinfo, though, especially when I joined in 2003, and I'm sure it was much more. You did talk about the IRC channel, the Microsoft Chat channel, which many people listening may not even have heard about. But there was this fantastic chat channel called MIRC or IRC, and in Cricinfo, basically, people who worked in Cricinfo, people who volunteered, scorers from all over the world, and everyone used to be on this channel, cricket channel. So,
yes.
And I found that, over time, as I kept using it and as I kept chatting with people, I found that to be a remarkable community, not just people who were completely clued into cricket, but also there was a real fraternity among that group, wasn't there?
I mean, the magical thing was that there were people on there who were not exactly full-time employees or even employees at all. They were people who were either volunteers or who were there for the love of the game and would do work if you wanted them to do some work. If the site went down at our end, or if we lost internet or whatever, somebody somewhere else in some part of the world who is watching a game live on TV would pick up scoring. Do you remember this kind of thing happening?
Yeah,
it was just a complete fraternity of cricket lovers, and Cricinfo at that time very much still seemed like that. It didn't seem, as I said, so much as a company, as a startup, which means that there were just people who are idealistic about what the project of Cricinfo itself was. And it was driven by love. I mean, none of our pay packets were huge at that time. I can tell you with great openness that I started off on a salary of 3,000 rupees a month. This was not a field that you went into to get rich. But all this community of people around the world who congregated on internet relay chat and who talked about cricket all day long. I mean, any time of the day, you could log in and you could see somebody there ready to talk about cricket and it was, it was not huge. You would still know most of their names. You grew to be quite good friends with them, with some of them. Some of them I've still never met, but I kind of occasionally ping on email or Facebook or whatever. But it was maybe the last gasp of being able to do that kind of journalism and coverage more out of love than out of any kind of corporate or profit-minded mindset.
Yeah, and for me, that IRC experience is pretty much the precursor to Twitter. I mean, many years before Twitter, you could just say anything on IRC, like say, randomly you would see somebody from Australia covering a league game, a club game, and saying something about it, and then you would find someone in England who would then pick that up and then add that tiny snippet to that scorecard, like tag it on to the notes in the scorecard and things. And these things were just remarkable to me. Like, what has happened? I mean, how amazing is this?
I mean, unlike cricket, there was unlike Twitter, there was something productive that was coming out of it also. I mean, there were these scorecards that were being generated and so on. I mean, Twitter, for all the energy, is basically dissipated into the atmosphere as heat and noise. But over here, there was a product at the end of the day that you could kind of go onto Cricinfo to see, or you could consult years later. That was astonishing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I clearly remember what you're saying about how when you're doing ball-by-ball coverage of a game on TV, and of course you have the classic Indian channels that would cut off the first ball and the last ball because they had to go for ads, especially Doordarshan. But there would be somebody in some other part of the world watching the same game, catching that sixth ball and putting in exactly what happened.
And putting it in, to the best of these guys, put it in exactly the kind of code that you needed to insert into the scoring data software. So all you need to do was copy paste that line and put it into the scoring software. It's not even like he was describing what happened. He would put in the command. He would put in where the shot was scored. He would put in a little line of commentary, and then you just had to copy paste it. It was really, really something.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me quite nostalgic now. So, but of course, I did hear recently that it still exists. And one of the sergeant, in fact, who
Yes.
told me a couple of years ago that it actually still exists. And I'm like, okay, I should probably just get on at some point, download IRC and see what's happening there at some point of time.
You're saying IRC, that channel still exists?
Apparently, yeah.
You have just destroyed a better part of my working day for the rest of my working life, I think. I mean, all I have to do is download MIRC and get back onto, chat with all these guys, and that's it. The day will evaporate.
All right. So you have said how it was, this whole period was such a happy time for you. So tell us about leaving in 2003 when you were in Mumbai, and I was there that time too, and you did quit and you went back to Chennai to freelance. What drove you to that?
I mean, there were a number of factors. One of them was that I think I didn't the most basic materialistic one was that I didn't enjoy living in Bombay, and I was not making a lot of money. So it was actually quite difficult on a month-to-month basis to make ends meet. So that was one. The second also was that I was idly then starting to wonder, it had been 2 years in Cricinfo, and I was starting to wonder slowly whether there were not other things that I could be writing about that might be fun to write about. I had other interests, and I thought, okay, it's so much fun to write about cricket. I mean, it must be as much fun to write about literature or movies or, to do longer feature-length pieces about other things. So I was starting to think about that. But I think also that there was a certain cusp that the game itself was approaching, and the coverage of the game was approaching around 2003, 2004, where increasingly it seemed as if to do anything meaningful or to produce anything meaningful required a certain kind of access. And, I remember very vividly, there was at one point in early 2004, I still wanted to be in cricket journalism then. I was interviewing with a TV channel. This was, I can say the name, it's CNN IBN, and they had a sports desk, and I was thinking, let me go see what TV is like. So I went for the interview. I got past one round and there was another round of interviews, and there was a question asked to me then at that point that really sort of put me off, which was, they said, which cricketers do you know personally? And I said, well, I don't know anybody personally. I mean, it's not like I hang out with these guys in my spare time and so on. Then they said, okay, whose number do you have on your phone?
Oh, wow.
And that question struck me as sort of quite emblematic of the direction in which these things were heading, right? Whose number do you have on your phone? Who can you call for a quote? Seemed to be the kind of emphasis that would be laid increasingly in cricket journalism. And there were, and player access was getting increasingly hard. I remember one quite tragic, or sort of at least a very sad incident once when I was covering a test match, and I went to speak to Mohammad Kaif at the end of the day for something. Or maybe it was one day, I can't remember which game it was now, but I went to speak to Kaif at the end of the day, and Kaif said something quite poignant. He said, I know you've come to me only because you couldn't get any of the other bigger players. And 2002, 3, Kaif was still, quite young and raw. And that was the truth, actually. It was a sad truth. I had tried to sort of get an interview with somebody else, and that didn't work. And I needed to file something. So I approached Kaif and we talked, and it was enjoyable. But he said this, and that stuck with me as well. So I didn't know whether cricket was providing me. I'd gotten into cricket because I thought it was a great way to be literary and vivid in my writing. I thought it was a vehicle for that. And the fact that I was passionate about cricket helped a lot, because then you could really show that in your writing. But I didn't know whether that space to indulge in that kind of writing was still around. The other thing that was happening also was that match reports, the importance of the match report was dwindling more and more. I think in the 90s and so on, the match report was very often, if you hadn't seen the game, even if you had seen the game, it was the one point of reference for people who were following the game. And so you could make it long, you could make it interesting and vivid, and you could have short character studies within the larger mosaic of the day's play and so on. I think that was dwindling because people, A, didn't have time to read match reports, or B, were just happy with what was provided on television. There were plenty of other things online for people to read suddenly in 2002, 3, 4. And so you didn't necessarily have people coming to learn what you thought of yesterday's play. That was not also a priority anymore. So all of these little things were happening. And I thought it sort of put me in mind saying, maybe if I want to be a writer, maybe there are other fields in which I should be a writer. And I think largely, you should confirm this because you've been in cricket journalism much longer than I have, but I think largely that instinct was right. I think match reports are not that important anymore. And in fact, newspapers themselves give them very, very little space compared to what they used to earlier. Access journalism is rife. I mean, there is no way you'd be able to spend enough time with even a Kaif equivalent in the Indian team today to write a nice profile of him or a personality study of him and so on. The kind of literary writing that we all admire, that cricket used to support quite a bit, that has, dwindled into near non-existence.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Can't agree more. So I feel 2003-4. I mean, you obviously felt it. I think even till 2008, which is when the IPL began. I think even till then, at least Cricinfo was still pretty insistent on each match having a report, irrespective of which format it was and which thing it was. But the moment you had, when the IPL came in, then automatically you're looking for ways to tell a story of a T20 game that a match report can't really do much with. I mean, a match report, apart from that, you're looking for so much more. You're looking for the extra aspects to bring in. And so I think that was the turning point as far as I saw it. But of course, you probably, your reference point was slightly earlier. So I can totally understand what you're saying. But yes, even somebody as experienced and as accomplished as Sharda Ugra, who was on the pod, recently mentioned how it's so difficult for even a person like her to get access to any of these players. And you would think that players would really want to talk to someone like her because she's someone who can tell a good story. She's a good writer. There's a lot of integrity there. There's a lot of craft there. But she's not. She said it's extremely hard to get access. So yeah, absolutely. Totally get that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2003, there was still, I remember, I think at that time, the magazine, Wisden used to have a magazine, Wisden Cricket Monthly. I think that was still going, and it was still a really good product. And of course, now we have the Cricket Monthly itself, where you do still have long, interesting, beautifully written pieces. I mean, that is still a foremost avenue for this kind of thing. But you will see very frequently that even the pieces in the Cricket Monthly are not always of players in the here and now. And they are, a lot of them are sort of looking back. And I think a large part of that is because access is so difficult these days. And you catch a player just when he's making the transitioning to making the transition to the big league, when he's still sort of accessible and he can still go back to his hometown and talk to parents and coaches and all these kind of things. Or that's it. I mean, otherwise, then the window is shut. The minute he has an agent and has an Instagram account and can control his own narrative, the window has closed for you to be able to spend any time writing with him, to write in a meaningful way about him. And I think that's kind of sad, because I think it's very sad. In fact, I think cricket literature suffers greatly for it.
Yeah, I mean, Wisden Asia Cricket, that the magazine that you're talking about, back in 2004, did this cover story on the Fab Four, which back then was Ganguly, Tendulkar, Dravid, and Lakshman. Of course, many now may disagree and say Ganguly doesn't belong there and Sehwag should be there, but that's fair enough. But they did the story where each one talks about, actually there's Fab Five, there was even Sehwag, where each one talks about the other. And then you have, Dravid talking about Tendulkar talking about Lakshman, and that kind of thing. And can you even imagine like a big story where, Rohit talking about Pujara and Pujara talking about Kohli or anything of that sort now? I mean,
impossible. Absolutely. You're completely right. And Sharda made a very good point that I think, the cricketers today don't realize. And I really, it was a very wise point to make, which is that they may be in control of their narrative now. They may have these, between advertisements and Instagram and Twitter, they feel like they can tell their story in the here and now as they are still playing. But Sharda's point that cricket writers and cricket itself will outlast them. And, there will be a time 20 years down the line when if you want to learn about Virat Kohli, you will have to turn to the printed word to learn about him. Nobody will have time to go back and revisit videos of Virat Kohli batting to see what the batting was like, or even if they do, they still won't know what he's like as a person. And certainly nobody will be going back to their Instagram feed and kind of seeing how he was working out in the gym and so on. So they are really depriving themselves of being memorialized in a particular way in the future. And I think in an earlier era, of course, this was all we had. I mean, we didn't have the internet or Instagram or anything like that. And maybe de facto people had to turn to the printed word, but the printed word was also more important. And I think cricketers of an earlier time would have realized that importance even more. A lot of the other thing also is that there's a lot of controversy around how much about cricket's history cricketers should know, right? Should they be great readers about the sport itself? Should they know its history and things like that? I think there was one instance where, was it Sehwag who broke Pankaj Roy's record in some way? And
yeah, he didn't.
Kind of record.
He was on the verge of breaking it. Yeah.
Right. And he didn't even know that such a record existed. Now, arguably, the one argument that is definitely there to be made is, look, a lot of cricketers do not come from the privilege where they can read about cricket's history and know the records and so on. And it shouldn't really matter. If you're an intuitive, natural talent like Sehwag, you should be just able to go out there and bat without knowing whose record you may or may not break. That's a very fair argument. But there is also I think earlier there was definitely a case that a lot of people who were in the game also read about the game because there was nothing else to do. I mean, there was no other way to learn, what people before you had done, or people, what the seniors were doing when you were a kid or an up-and-coming cricketer and so on. You had to read. You may not always even have been able to watch games on television and so on. So I think the practice of reading about the game itself was there even within the game rather than just among the fans and devotees. Maybe that itself has dwindled now. I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to find out how much a Kohli reads about the game. Has Kohli read Corner of a Foreign Field, for example? Has he read Pundits in Pakistan? A lot of these books that are milestones in Indian cricket literature, have they read these things? And maybe that is part of the answer as to why they don't really give enough importance to the written word at all.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And also, I think earlier the reading came from the fact that cricketers learnt a lot by reading reports and pieces on the players. It was their way of gaining knowledge about how to play the game. Even writers like Rajan Bala, who were so good with describing technicalities of players and analyzing each one's technique, has, other players have spoken about how reading Rajan Bala's reports actually helped them in their own game. and help them refine their own technique. But now with television, I think commentary and television has now taken over that space. So players now learn almost everything about their game from the commentary, and so then the reading and the word has now taken the back seat. But yes, I think doing both will only enhance the players' knowledge of the game and their view. But whether they have the time or not is another
that's true.
issue altogether.
Like Vijay Lokapalli told this anecdote on your podcast, I think, about how Gavaskar used to keep reading all the time. I mean, not just cricket books, but all books. I've heard anecdotes from journalists about how Dravid, when Dravid was overseas on tours, he would approach. So other cricketers would sometimes come to Indian journalists and they would say with great sort of embarrassment, saying, "Listen, I have 3 bottles of whiskey I want to take back, but I can only bring 2 through customs. Okay, will you take 1 back for me?" You know, that used to be their request. Dravid used to be the kind who would come and say, "Listen, I bought too many books on this tour. Can you just take some back with you? I'll take them from you in India." You know, that used to be his request. And so, but whether that kind of habit exists now among the current team is difficult to say. I don't know. And maybe people will sort of call it elitist and privileged, and to even expect that of cricketers who are otherwise such remarkable talents. I mean, should we expect Kohli to also be a reader? I don't know. It's difficult to say.
Well, irrespective of whether we expect him to be a reader or not, I think we would love for somebody to have the access to him to talk about reading or to talk about cricket and talk about how he learns the game, how he experiences the game, enjoys it. And given that only 2 or 3 people can perhaps talk to him, and that too once in a year or so, that aspect of it is diminished. That we don't
with the 2 great cricket stories of the last 20 years, when I'm talking about individual cricketers, the 2 great stories of the last 20 years have been untold. The transition of how Kohli went from good, promising, slightly chubby-faced talent to the machine that he is now. How he did that and why he did that story is untold. The story of Dhoni as a person, as a character, has been untold. I mean, he's still, there have been small profiles here and there, but he is still essentially a cipher, partly because he wants to present himself that way, but also partly because it is just, access to the world around Dhoni is so difficult. So not only are they controlling their own presence in the public domain, but they're also sort of the 1 circle or 2 circles around them also clearly have been told never to talk to journalists at any great length or in any great depth, because we have not read anything about him that is even, the kind of classic profile where you don't talk to the person himself or herself, but you talk to people around them. Even that has not been done with Dhoni in a really meaningful way. So, that's a huge gaping loss in Indian cricket's history for the last 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the very first issue of the Cricket Monthly, in fact, the cover story was on Dhoni, and the title of that was "The Star We Do Not Know," the star we don't know, and which tells you everything you need to, which is both a shame as well as the truth. That, would you ever say that about Sachin, who, of course, I wouldn't say he was extremely illuminating in all his interviews or anything like that, but still, a lot of people who grew up around Sachin and who watch Sachin feel they know him quite intimately, thanks to the writers who were able to bring forth so much about his life and also had access to him.
There is, it also does fit into a larger trend where I think people in positions of power, whether it's in cricket or anywhere else, have realized increasingly, and of course, the internet has a lot to do with this, that they don't need what you might call traditional journalism. So the reason why a certain prime minister of ours doesn't give press conferences, which is, 6 years into, we don't want to get into politics too much, but 6 years into his prime ministership, he has not given a press conference at all. It is the same kind of realization that I think cricketers have come to. They don't need the press. We have come to a stage where the press needs them more. And that's not a healthy relationship in any way. That's not how journalism and cricket should coexist, or journalism in any field should coexist.
Yeah, one of the things though about not being in full-time in cricket, which you would have probably realized almost immediately after you left, was that when you were in Cricinfo and when you were doing, you had work assigned to you. like you had a game that you would have had to either do commentary on or write a report on or do something. And a lot of the times you probably, there would have been games that were not all interesting. Some might have been drab. Some might have gone on for too long. But once you were out, did you feel this sudden, almost a fresh sort of a lease where you could see whatever you wanted? You could pick and choose. You could watch cricket as and when you pleased. You could watch one ball. You could watch 10 overs, and nobody would say anything.
Yeah, I mean, it was liberating in that sense, but it never felt like a compulsion while I was doing the job, I think. I mean, even then, I think I always enjoyed, admittedly, there were some extremely dull matches in the 2007 World Cup that I think, I would have been hard-pressed to cover in any interesting way, or to write about in any interesting way, or even to do ball by ball in any interesting way. But by and large, yeah, I mean, it was... it's funny, but I think after 2000, when I left Cricinfo, for a while, my cricket watching dropped. And I think it may have been a result of having watched so much of the game in my 2 years there, and 2 years is not even a long time. There are people who've been doing it decades and they still sort of continue to do it. But for my limited appetite at that time, I think maybe I thought, okay, I've seen so much, let me now do other things. There was a phase where I was watching a lot of films. And so it was still a very formative professional time for me. And I think I was trying to experiment with as many things as possible to see what I liked best and what I was good at. So because of that, my cricket watching came down a little bit, but definitely my writing about cricket came down drastically. I would write the odd feature here and there. And then for a long time, I wrote nothing at all. And I think after that, the only thing I wrote, the first big piece I wrote was the Lalit Modi profile in Caravan in 2011, I think.
Yeah, so let's come to that, the Lalit Modi profile. I mean, one of the things about that profile, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure, is that you didn't have access to him, right?
I didn't have access to him, no.
Yeah, so talk us about that piece, because it was the first real, Lalit Modi had been around since 2000, since ever. But then, of course, he came into prominence in the IPL in 2007 when he set it up. And then 2008 was the first IPL. And then 2010 was around when he got into trouble. And it was until then, I mean, there had not been a piece so wide-ranging on him until your piece came about. So talk us about that, the reasons for taking up that assignment, and what fascinated you about him, as well as, and you also looked at him as a vehicle to tell the bigger stories of both the IPL as well as the India's relationship with cricket at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of classic things that happened while the IPL was actually going on, these things we've already talked about. One is that Lalit Modi and the IPL, the establishment at large, this thing of not needing the press, or not needing a particular kind of press, not needing traditional journalism, for anything, was very true. So, they needed television, and they would get all their money and their coverage on TV. But they didn't need reporters writing about them. It wasn't essential to their project. And so they kind of, again, access was very tightly restricted. I think 2008 to 10, when he was actually still in the IPL, it would have been very difficult to write about him, is my suspicion. The second thing also is this culture of doing, because of what we talked about earlier, this culture of being able to do these long stories itself had sort of dwindled. The magazines and newspapers weren't really giving that much space and time and depth to do these pieces. Access was difficult, so you forget access to players, even access to administrators who are sort of public servants in a particular way. Even that had dwindled and limited. So so I got there. I was very lucky because I quit a job in 2010, which enabled me to start doing freelance long pieces. And 2011 was when Lalit Modi was already in England. He had already fled. He was already sort of in exile or whatever. And so suddenly a lot of these doors opened up. I think he was not in power anymore in any meaningful way. And you could slide into these cracks in his inner circles and start talking to people who knew him. And that was, it was a complete stroke of fortune for me. And it was something that was assigned to me again by an editor who knew that I had long time ago in a previous life, I had been a cricket journalist. And so I spent, I don't know, 3.5 months sort of talking to people in Madras, in Delhi, in Rajasthan, in Bombay, all over the place. And I think I must have done 40, 45, 50 interviews for that one piece. Amazingly, I got a response from his dad, although it was an emailed response, not a phone conversation of any kind. But that was something that but it was also the first time I was writing a piece of that length, 7,000 or 8,000 words. It was something I'd been dying to do because I felt this was my natural length and form. And so I really I dove into it. I completely waded into it with great excitement and enthusiasm. And then the piece came out, I think in like sort of mid 2011 is when it came out. I can't remember the date now.
Yeah, and you also did write, I think around that time, over a period of a year or two, you did, and even maybe around 2009, you did write quite a bit, I mean, at least a couple of pieces about the IPL and how, this was this new tournament that was taking India by storm. And this piece pretty much also had aspects of that on how, a game that you had at least been introduced to back in the mid 90s, you suddenly have, it's unrecognizable, at least in parts, to a lot of India.
I mean, a lot of people would say it was the natural endpoint for a process that began in 1996. I mean, the commercialization of the game, of the World Cup in 96, the natural extension of that was the IPL in 2008. So in one sense, there's a neat bookend to my own sort of cricket experience between 96 and my Lalit Modi piece. But it was impossible to not see the IPL as a metaphor for something bigger. I mean, I think, it was too blatant for that. I mean, the fact that it was simultaneously political and film related and cricket related and was extravagant and flamboyant
and shady
and extremely shady and, shot through with aspects of greed and corruption. So, all of this was too huge a symbol to ignore. And I think that was something so these are the things, I mean, to go back to what we said earlier on this podcast, this was, we talked about ways in which cricket writing can be literary. And one way to do that is to treat cricket as a metaphor for something else, or to read into cricket some grander or bigger themes in our lives or in society and so on. Corner of a Foreign Field again is a perfect example of that. It is cricket, but it is cricket as relates to this central question of untouchability in caste and and pre-independence India. So this was another way, I think, to do that. I mean, so it really sort of energized me because of it, because suddenly I was writing about cricket from an oblique sort of angle. It was not head-on writing a match report, which is enjoyable in and of itself as long as you can do it with a certain freedom and at a certain length. But the way to sort of analyze cricket in a different way or to situate it into something bigger, I think it felt enjoyable and liberating and interesting. And also it felt new because again, people weren't doing enough of that. I felt because there was no magazine like Caravan until then that gave you the length to do it.
In looking back, do you think that talking to Modi would have enhanced the piece, or would it have taken away some other aspects of the piece that you could add because you didn't speak to him?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, I think it would definitely have enhanced the piece because, as I'm finding out now during this coronavirus lockdown, there is no substitute for meeting an interview subject in person. I mean, the personal interview and the impressions that a person makes on you when they're in front of you, flesh and blood, it's difficult to replace. I mean, everything else is a second and slightly poor substitute. However much of it you do, and I've done this multiple times, with other profiles also I've done this where you are forced to talk to people who know your subject rather than your subject itself. And you can do as much of it as you possibly can, but it's still not essentially enough, I think. I did watch at that time. Lalit Modi was very active on Twitter, which was still sort of a relatively new thing back then. So I did watch very curiously to see. I mean, of course, the main thing was that I was wondering if he would sue, if I'd gotten something wrong and he would sue because of that. That didn't happen. But then secondarily, I was very curious to see from what he would make of this picture that I painted of him. And so I tracked his Twitter feed for a few days and so on. And I think he just kind of tweeted it out, but otherwise didn't say much about it one way or another.
Oh, okay, okay. So he basically said no comment.
He basically just, yeah, he tweeted it out. I think he was and probably still is the kind of person for whom any publicity is great publicity. So I think he must have been delighted that somebody spent this much time writing about him, but he didn't say anything more than that.
Okay. So, all right. So we have spoken about, given reference to your first book, which was Following Fish, and I'll link that in the notes as well, where you mentioned, we have this brief mention of Jayasurya. But through this whole time, I mean, through the 2000s when you were out of cricket, did your Sri Lankan love still continue? I do remember you mentioning that you used to at least watch the World Cups quite closely, because that was a time when Sri Lanka did pretty well in the World Cups that happened.
Yeah, and I mean, it was look, even in India before I went to the US, it was difficult not to follow Sri Lankan cricket because very often Sri Lankan cricket was Indian cricket. Every alternate week, I think they would play a Test series and a tri series or whatever. It seemed like they were touring and playing each other all the time. So I would follow that, and then of course, uh, when as long as that initial squad of '96, even some members of that remained, I was really sort of so hooked onto the Sri Lankan team. So, Murli played for a long time. Jayasuriya played for a long time. And all of these people were still cricketers that I was watching. The 2007 World Cup, where they went to the final, I remember was a moment of great excitement for me. I was living in New York at the time doing my master's. My friend and I found some Australian bar that was willing to open at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning because Australia was also in the final. So it was a big moment for everyone. So we went down to this Australian bar at 7 o'clock in the morning. I think there were beers being served at 8. And we were waiting around. There were kangaroo sliders going around and things like that. And we watched this game. It turned out to be an utterly one-sided contest, unfortunately. But I did follow until all of these players, until at least one of those players remained, I followed Sri Lanka very closely. After the new guard came in, I realized that I couldn't quite keep up as much as I wanted to. I was overseas for a lot of the time, and it was difficult always to get coverage of these games when they happened on TV and so on. For a long while, I think even until quite recently, I don't think I've seen many Sri Lanka games live on TV, so to speak.
So, did this whole Sri Lankan cricket love and Sri Lankan cricketers' love then translate on to Sri Lanka love in general? Because you did write this wonderful book based in Sri Lanka. You spent a lot of time there, which again I link, this divided island. And talk us about, was there any connection at all, or how did that love develop, or was it totally independent?
It must have been totally independent. I mean, of course, being interested in the Sri Lankan cricket team led me to being interested in Sri Lanka. So there were a couple of chances for me to travel there in the early 2000s. And so I took them with open hands because I really wanted to go see this country. And then I had some friends from Sri Lanka who further drove my interest. So obviously there were a lot of little things, but I think the book came about quite independently. I think it came about because, it seemed the war had ended in 2009 and 2010 was when Following Fish came out, and I was thinking, what other books can I and should I do? And it seemed like a very natural thing for a journalist who is from India, who speaks Tamil, to at least go to Sri Lanka to do some reporting on the post-war situation. So it wasn't related to the cricket per se, but I have to say, when I was in Sri Lanka reporting and I would talk to people, and also many conversations were made much easier, at least at the beginning, by conversations about cricket. Before you got to sort of the sensitive things about what you did in the war, during the war, and so on, I think there were many conversations where I would start by talking about cricket and tell them that I was a cricket journalist, and we would talk for a little while about. Inevitably, the '96 World Cup came up, as you can imagine. So we would talk a little bit about that, and then we would get on to the slightly more weighty matters at hand.
Yeah, I mean, I was when I was reading the book, I was curious to know if there would be any cricket in there. But as far as I know, I don't even think I saw any mention of it. Was it partly because you were, of course, dealing with far weightier matters, so you didn't want to put in matters as trivial as cricket in there, or did it just not come up in the writing process itself?
there were a lot of things that really intrigued me about, Sri Lankan cricket. For a while, I considered whether, a little part of the book should be a profile of Murli, the quintessential Sri Lankan Tamil, who had made it onto the world stage and had become a pan-Sri Lankan star. Should I write about him and his experience and kind of somehow try to tell a part of the story of Sri Lankan Tamil identity through that? For reasons unconnected to the book, I was really, really curious, and I still am completely entranced by the idea of doing a long piece about the school match in Colombo that happens every year, which you must no doubt have heard of also. The Royal Tomian match. Yeah, that happens every year. It's supposed to be the oldest school fixture in the world or something of the sort that is still ongoing. And it's just sort of 3 days of, it's been going on for all this time. Apparently now it's come down to 3 days of utter debauchery where people are just like drunk in the stands all the time while the cricket goes on. I just feel like it's a fascinating story waiting to be told. The oldest cricket match in the world is definitely something that deserves a full profile of its own. So
in fact, Mike Marques's book, War Minus the Shooting, about the 1996 World Cup, he when he makes the trip to Sri Lanka, he actually goes for this game. The 96 edition of this game, and he has this whole chapter where he talks about this game, and he then builds it around into the history of Sri Lankan cricket and things. So it's fascinating. I'll link that book.
Yeah. And of course there was one person who I would interview quite often, one of my sources, who for some reason had a membership of or was able to get into the bar at the P. Sara Oval, and so we would go quite often and sit on the edge of the P. Sara ground and kind of look out into the pitch, and we would have sort of a drink or two, and we would talk about actually we were talking not about cricket, but we were talking about human rights and so on, all this stuff. But I remember that was the other sort of strange connection between cricket and the work that I was doing when I was in Sri Lanka in 2011-12.
Very interesting. I somehow thought for whatever reason, maybe it was because I know you from before, I thought that there might be some cricket in there, but well, the book remains wonderful nevertheless. So I no complaints about that. Moving on. I mean, we did start the conversation about Sachin, so we should probably wrap up as well. Maybe with the question about Sachin. You were one of those lucky ones to make it to his final test. So talk about that and talk about the experience and, was it something that you just felt you had to do, or is it something you were assigned? And also about the day itself, the final day when he retired and all the speech and the general ambience in the crowd.
This is definitely going to make me tear up at some point. So I'm going to be as careful as possible. I mean,
come on, it's not like it's Jayasuriya retiring or something. It's just Sachin.
It is just Sachin. That is true. What to say? I mean, look, there was no doubt that I had to try to go for this. Tickets, as you can imagine, were extremely hard to come by. But my brother-in-law, who lived in Bombay, I think had swung a ticket, and so therefore we both decided to go for the final day.
Oh, you didn't go as a press person. You didn't go as a journalist.
I know. It was only secondarily that I pitched a piece to somebody and said, listen, I'm going to this test. Should I write a piece? And my editor at the New Yorker at the time, he said, yeah, why don't you write a web piece about this? So I wrote a piece about the final day. But in a sense, I thought it would be awful to go to Sachin's last test in Bombay and watch it from the press box. I mean, you should be in the stands with the fans, so to speak, right? So I thought it was a much wiser thing to watch it from the stands in any case. So we got the ticket, and with great difficulty, and I was not able to go for all 5 days, unfortunately. So I only went for the day when I was fairly sure that Sachin would bat. I think it was a Friday, I remember, and I think he came out to bat, or he left the field on a Friday just before lunch, I remember. Because he'd been batting overnight, I think, right? And he left on Friday. And I mean, what is there to say that doesn't sound like a cliche anymore? I mean, unfortunately, everything is a cliche, and it is still true. If it is the end of all our childhoods, the end of all our boyhoods, a complete icon sort of playing for. I mean, who would ever have thought that he would have played so long when he made his debut, to have spanned the better part of 3 decades playing cricket at the top level, and to feel the love for him in Bombay in the stadium on that day was unmistakable. I mean, you've seen, of course, everybody who has heard this podcast has seen that iconic photo, right, of Sachin coming out, and the stairway is empty, but then there's a barrier, and all these faces pressed against that barrier, watching him walk down the stairs, that is how Sachin lived his life. There was a barrier between us and him, and he lived in this little bubble where he batted, and all our faces were pressed up against that bubble all the time, trying to get as much of him as possible and trying to see as much of him and know him as much as possible. And that it was, it was impossible to be there and not cry, Sid. I think I gave in as much as anybody else's. I mean, it was a really I mean, again, the cliche comes to mind: the end of boyhood, the end of our childhoods.
Yeah, and I mean, I will link the piece that you wrote, obviously, but is there anything that that you remember from people around you or in the stands around you? Was there, was it just overwhelming emotion, and especially when he had that speech, and I think that made people tear up much more, because you have this guy who's finished his career and who's now coming and giving, I mean, quite a touching speech, I would think.
Yeah. I mean, it was touching. It was a little cheesy in parts, but there was nothing about the speech that was not sincere. And I think that was something that was quite moving. He could have used it to be, I don't know, to be a platform for grandstanding, or to segue smoothly into another career in some other part of cricket administration or whatever, or to settle old scores or whatever. But there was nothing about that. It was long and it was cheesy. And it was exactly the thing that we needed to hear at that time. We were all so emotional. And what we needed then was a moment of catharsis where you could just sort of break down completely at that cheesy speech and feel much better at the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if anything like that will ever happen again, right? I mean, it's just such a weirdly, I mean, everything, the timing of his entry, the whole connection. I mean, of course, there's a lot of tenuous connections made between India opening up its economy and Sachin, but in a way, the whole timing has had so much to play with, so much role to play in how we saw him and how how he was so pan-Indian. I mean, I guess Virat Kohli retiring will be an emotional moment, but will it be as cathartic is another question.
Absolutely. No, I don't think so at all. I mean, at least not for me. I mean, there may be another generation now that is growing up with Kohli that feels the same way. But for Sachin, I mean, to have everything happen at once, right? To have India open up and television boom through the country, and have Sachin simultaneously at the peak of his game, all of that to happen was a little too much, I think. But that was one moment. Let me tell you, we've talked earlier about how we are always looking for or want to see metaphors in the game for bigger things and so on. But that was one moment when he retired. I felt like I didn't want to look at the metaphor. I didn't want to see Sachin as a metaphor for Indian liberalization or whatever. I just wanted to see him as a still young man in his 30s, still young, who had just sort of mastered this game and he had been playing it for such a long time from such a young age. I mean, just the mechanics of how he did what he did is something that could, I've talked about this with my friends often. My favorite kind of cricket anecdote is a kind of anecdote where the top players talk about Sachin or other superstar players in a tone of awe, like they say, I don't know how he did this. Like, I don't know how he was, so I've heard this numerous times about Sachin from other cricketers who have played at the international level, and who will still sort of say, on that day, for example, Pakistan, 1999, Madras, that test match, you didn't know how he was doing what he was doing, that kind of awe that Sachin used to inspire when he was at his peak. That is what I wanted to remember him by on that day. I didn't want to think about liberalization and color TV and commercialization and all of that stuff. And of course, we all know, I mean, the arguments against Sachin are trotted out again and again about how he didn't help India win enough and how he
retired, didn't retire on time, and
didn't retire on time, was sometimes a selfish player. All of these have been heard again and again. But even now, you go back and sometimes you watch some of these videos on YouTube of Sachin batting in the 90s and early 2000s, when he still sort of didn't care, when he was young and could afford to be brazen and, dare we say it, arrogant when he was batting. it's imperious. And that's what I wanted to remember Sachin as, just as somebody who could be in total command of the game and in a way that very few other people could.
Yeah, I think that point is extremely important. I mean, I don't think I've seen any other player, at least in my experience, any other player in that generation. I mean, be it Lara or be it anyone who was perhaps could on par with Sachin, if not better, on their day, but being spoken of with such awe by his peers and by teammates. I think that if there was anyone keeping count of that, I think Sachin would win that award quite handily.
Yeah, because I'm sure there are things that Sachin does that we don't see as people watching on TV, or even as cricket journalists who have learned to analyze the game a little bit. I think there are things that he does on a particular pitch. We don't know how a wicket plays. We don't know how hard a bowler is to face on a particular day, whereas other batsmen who have been there on that time have known that. And so they are the ones, when they speak of a particular innings as being slightly, mind-blowing even for them, then you realize you are hearing or talking about something truly special.
Yeah, I think there's, our good friend Rahul Bhattacharya mentions this. I mean, it takes a great one to know what Sachin could do.
There is, yeah. I mean, it's funny you mentioned Rahul because, he wrote this piece about Lara, right? His 153. Yeah. And so in that, there is one anecdote by, I think who says it? I think Ramnaresh Sarwan says it, or somebody says it, where, there is a field set to him on the offside, which is kind of packed. And he says, he tells Sarwan or the other non-striker, saying that, I'm going to hit this ball in front of square, and then I'm going to hit it further in front of square still, so that the fielder moves, and then I'm going to hit it behind square. Yeah. And he executes that completely, to perfection. That is the kind of thing that, even to somebody like Sarwan, who is a very talented batsman, it blows him away. He's like, how does he do that? So that breed of anecdote, or that character of anecdote, is there so many times in Sachin's career. And I think that is the greatest testament to just how thoroughly he was a master of batting.
Absolutely. So in the final segment, actually the penultimate segment, but one thing I wanted to definitely ask you, and a lot of our listeners also have requested us if we could ask our guests to recommend cricket books for them. And given that you are such a eclectic reader and who've read a lot of cricket books, I thought I can ask you for some recommendations. So just these, of course, these need not be like, I'm not saying that these need to be the greatest books or anything in your estimation, but something that you feel that listeners would benefit if they read and would also enjoy if they read.
So obviously there are a lot of cricket books that are so-called the usual suspects, right? So we should mention them, but maybe we can think about some slightly more interesting and less known ones to talk about.
That was what I was looking for. Yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, I will make the sort of compulsory recommendations of Pandits from Pakistan, Chinaman by Shehan Karunatilaka, Corner of a Foreign Field by Ram Guha, and of course the Picador Book of Indian Cricket, which we talked about earlier in the podcast. So these are all, this is the canon. Everything that Gideon here writes obviously is like, is worth reading time and time again. A few cricket books that I read that I sort of enjoyed, that maybe, I mentioned earlier in this podcast that somewhere I found a copy of The Art of Cricket by Don Badman, which I thought was enormously interesting and clear and insightful in a way that I hadn't expected it to be. I thought it seemed like a very boring title. And I thought to hear a genius like Don Bradman talk about how to bat or how to play the game would inevitably mean that he's not communicating, because so much of what he did was intuitive. I imagine that, it would be very difficult to communicate that on the page. And so maybe it was just a vague, fluffy book. But I remember it as being sort of gripping reading. Really, really insightful and analytical about the sport. So that is something I recommend. Quiet Flows the Dawn by Jack Fingleton, which is the other classic Australian book in the Bradman sort of Bradmanology field, so to speak. That is an excellent book. I think it's really sort of written by somebody who knew Bradman well, and again was somebody who was a great analyst of the game. So those are great. The most moving book on cricket I've read, and most enjoyable, and the one that has the most charm, I think, is Autobiography of an Unknown Cricketer by Sujit Mukherjee, which you must have also read, of course.
Yes, and you wrote a piece on it as well, connecting that with another book. So I'll link that too. But yes, absolutely. I think, and I don't think this is a book that is as widely read or even as widely available as it should be. And I remember picking this up, in a secondhand bookstore long back, and nobody had even recommended it to me. I just picked it up, and then I'm reading it, and I'm like, oh my goodness, why is that? Why didn't anyone tell me about this book?
So first of all, it is an ode to cricket, right? I mean, it is just full of love, and it is not any kind of backhanded love where there is love and also resentment at not having played at the highest level, or love but spurned love that the game sort of didn't treat you as well as it should. It is just pure love, 100%. It's the the adoration for cricket comes through so well, precisely because he was so far from, or relatively far from, playing at the highest level, right? I mean, he never was even in India probable, I think, in any way. So he learned very quickly to make his peace with the cricket that he did get. Sujit Mukherjee played a little bit for Bihar, but not too much. And, then sort of went on to do other things in life, but always remembered the game with such fondness and wrote about his time playing cricket with such devotion. So that is one aspect of it. And it's, every time you read it, it kind of moves you, that the love that he felt for the game. The second thing that I think is, of course, the prose is amazing. And in fact, I called up a few of the sentences that I remember from the book, and I want to just read them because this is not the kind of prose that you find very commonly in any writing in any field. So it is really that good. So, for example, he's talking about, the typical Patna sports fan. He might have this fan may be a bidi or a pan seller or a driver of a cycle rickshaw or whatever. So Mukherjee writes, to them, a sweaty footballer was many times more glamorous than a sweatered cricketer. And then he once played against Bengal, I think, and there was a fast bowler on the Bengal team who was very good, and Mukherjee lasted exactly 4 balls. So he writes later, had he been of quicker pace, one would have had less time to think and thus been compelled to bat instinctively. But 3 times I looked for the ball everywhere, and 3 times my bat was nowhere near the ball as it swung in, pitched, and whisked away. I mean, these are sentences anybody would be proud to write. Forget a former cricketer or whatever. So the prose is great. But, the ultimate sort of quality of this book, I think, is how universal it is for all of us. I mean, any of us who have played cricket at any level, be it, corridor cricket with a bat and a plastic ball, or test cricket at Lords. There's so much in this that you can relate to. I think he captures more than any other cricket book that I've read. He captures that kind of universality of the cricket experience. That is something that is so rare. And I think for that reason alone, I would recommend this book. Unfortunately, I don't know if it's out of print. It may be. It should not be. I hope somebody brings it out. But definitely there may be copies floating around on Amazon or whatever. I know that when I had to review it, I had to read it once more. So I had to buy a used copy of Amazon, which I still have. But I'd read it for the first time, I think, maybe in the early 2000s or mid 2000s or something like that. And at that time, I borrowed it from a friend.
Yeah, and it's a book that, the great books, and even within cricket, if you take, CLR James or Gideon Haigh or any of those, this is another kind of book that reveals new things on each reading. And I've read it about 3 times now over a span of, say, 20, I would say 15 years. But I would love to read it again. And in fact, after talking about this, I'll probably go the next few days and pick it up and read some part of it again.
Yeah. And it's such a slim book, so small. I mean, it's not some big tome or anything like that. It's just, it's the ultimate sort of amateurs ode to the sport, I think, or the amateurs' prayer to the gods of cricket, basically and it's a delight to read. And the thing that is remarkable about it also is that it conjures up this time that we all think of as sort of idyllic and so on. This time before, obviously, we've talked about commercialization. So this time before commercialization, but a time also where cricket was competitive, but clearly not life or death, at least not for Sujit Mukherjee, who had other things going on in his life, So there is that quality of cricket that you find when you play sort of a totally amateur game on a warm English summer afternoon. You're kind of standing somewhere in the, I don't know, third man or fine leg or whatever. The ball is not really coming to you, but you're just enjoying being outdoors on a beautiful day, watching this cricket unfold in front of you, being with a team, doing your thing when it's your turn to bat or bowl, but otherwise sort of just reveling in being in the middle of cricket. That feeling is so strong in the Sujit Mukherjee book, I feel.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the things that he mentions in that book, if I'm not mistaken, is the smells of cricket. Whether it's in the dressing room or whether it's just outdoors, and how, the smell of that sweaty gloves can be quite intoxicating. And that comes out in that book as well.
And I've smelled once after I read that, I remember like recognizing that smell and looking out for it every time I was somewhere near a cricket ground. I mean, or like when I was near enough to kit bags and so on. And he's completely right. It's a very particular kind of sweaty leather plastic kind of, leather, plastic and dirt and sweat. These are the things that you kind of get out of it that make for that aroma.
Wonderful. So, I think, again, we'll link to it if I find a link to it. Otherwise, try and pick it up wherever you can. I'm sure you can find people who will have it and you can borrow it from them maybe. So, thanks.
And if you borrow it, don't give it back.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't want to give it back. Thanks. So we've covered good ground. One thing I didn't mention about Samanth in the introduction and anywhere during the pod is Samanth is also a remarkable quizzer, and he has this hobby of quizzing where he excels at, and he also wrote a lovely piece recently for The Guardian about his pursuit of quizzing. So we thought we'll surprise Samanth a bit and give him a little bit of a cricket quiz, if you don't mind. Well, these are all, I had a bit of time before the podcast. So I said, why not just surprise Samanth a bit and give him like a 5-question quiz. And things, these are not like obscure things. These are all things that you can easily figure out. So are you game?
1996 World Cup means I'm ready. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, no, I mean, this will, so the first question is, I'm just giving you a quote and you just have to tell me who said this and when.
Okay.
Initially, when I batted for the last 7 overs of the day, it was the first time I batted in international cricket. I got 30 not out in 22 balls. When I came back to the dressing room, Azhar hugged me, gave me a new pair of shoes and said, I've never seen a youngster bat like this against Wasim and Waqar.
That must be Sachin.
That's what many people would say, but it's not.
Oh, wait, let me think again. Initially when I batted?
For the first seven, for the last 7 overs of the day, that was the first time I batted in international cricket. I got 30 not out in 22 balls. When I came back to the dressing room, Azhar, which is the clue here, because I guess, Sachin's first captain was Srikanth, right? So
sure. Oh, that's right. Yes.
Azhar hugged me, gave me a new pair of shoes and said, I've never seen a youngster bat like this against Wasim and Waqar. And even more interesting, Azhar said this and not to Sachin.
Was this Sadagopan Ramesh?
Yes, it was. So Azhar, who saw Sachin bat against Wasim and Waqar, said this to Sadagopan.
Although I have to say, I remember being there on that day. I mean, Sachin was hit on his first test, first test against Waqar, right? Yeah. Whereas, of course, Waqar and Wasim were much older by the time the 99 test came around. So maybe not quite as quick and so on. But Ramesh on that first day was something. I mean, he came out and he just, with his quintessential zero stroke play, he played zero footwork. He played all these beautiful strokes. He really seemed like he had just sort of, he had been batting for like years at international level.
And that just a quick step back and that push through cover, like firm.
That's it. Yes, absolutely. It was all timing. It was beautiful.
Yeah. Okay. So, I have a couple more, so I'll just quickly get through them.
Achha, so all of these questions are basically googlies also to continue the cricket theme. Very good.
Well, this one is not necessarily a googly, but I'm pretty sure it's... the very first test match that India won was in Madras in 1952 against India. And so, usually back then, the test was supposed to have a rest day on day 3, like tests did back then. But this particular test had an unscheduled rest day on day 2. This rather than day 3. This was because a major event had occurred back in England on day one of this test. What was this event? This was February 1952.
This must have been the death of King George.
Absolutely, yeah. So King George died on the first day of the test, so they pushed the test day to day 2. So there you go. You got 2. And then I'm just going to ask you a couple more and then we'll wrap up. So
super. Sounds good.
Who said about, okay, I'll just give you the quote and then you just tell me who said. I was nervous at first. The bowling part was quite normal for me. I was on a beach in the south coast and the shoot was scheduled for just before sunset. They asked me to bowl a few balls and stare down at the camera sternly. It was difficult for me because I'm too soft a person to put on an angry expression.
Oh, you have to say this again. Okay, say it again.
Okay, let me tell you. I'll give you another hint. Who said this about an event that occurred to him when he was 15 years old? Okay. I was nervous at first. The bowling part was quite normal for me. I was on the beach on the south coast and the shoot was scheduled for just before sunset. They asked me to bowl a few balls and stare down at the camera sternly. It was difficult for me because I'm too soft a person to put on an angry expression.
This is intriguing. Okay. Was this one of the bowlers in Fire in Babylon?
Absolutely correct.
This must be something like that.
This was the current West Indies captain, Jason Holder.
Jason Holder. Oh, wow. Okay.
He was 15 and he's the guy who comes in the first scene.
Oh, amazing. Okay. Oh, wow. It's a good piece of trivia.
Yeah. Good guess. Lovely guess. You got the movie. And so, okay. So the last question, again, about Chennai. 45-year-old S. Guruprasad, who currently lives in Chennai, is an assistant to a stockbroker. Mm-hmm. But late last year, in December last year, he got a call from his nephew in France and said that someone famous had tweeted about him and was looking to know how he could be contacted. Why was someone trying to contact S. Guruprasad in December last year?
And this was Sachin who tweeted, that he had gotten some advice from some unknown mama and wanted to know who that mama was, some wrist movement mama.
Yeah, this was a guy who back then worked in the Taj Coromandel Hotel.
That's right. Yes.
Advice from him. Yeah.
Yeah. Correct.
Fantastic. So see, it is so easy.
Not bad. As long as you stuck to players who we recall from the 90s or that kind of thing. Largely, I think I was okay.
I was not going to ask you questions about IPL stats. Don't worry.
Either, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I just thought that I'll keep it primarily Chennai focused and
super fun. Very good.
Okay, super. So thanks so much, Samanth, for this lovely time and giving us your insights and recommendations. Always lovely talking to you, and even more lovely talking to you for the podcast.
Thanks, Sid. It's been a total blast to be on this podcast. Something I've been listening to for so long now, and it's really, really nice to talk to somebody from the old days again about cricket and cricket journalism and the memories that we have from Cricinfo and earlier.
Fantastic, yeah, absolutely. And you listeners, you should follow Samanth, as I said, on Twitter. I'll give you his link, and you please read all the articles he puts out. He has articles on any subject that you're looking for. You can find it in his archive, or he has a website too. I can give you a link to that. So, and keep listening to the podcast, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of another episode of the 81 All Out podcast. Please subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you prefer. It would be wonderful if we could leave a rating and a review so that more people find us. You can also follow us on Twitter at 81 All Out and check out all our previous podcasts and articles on our website, 81allout.com. In case you're still listening, here's a shout out to our sister podcast on regional movies, whereistheotherbanana.com. You can follow them on Twitter at theotherbanana and watch out for updates on all the movie reviews and discussions that they put out. As always, we would love to hear your thoughts on the work we do, so please send us your feedback. Goodbye.
In the air, Srijan takes it! India win! He'll come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series.
They're going to get back for two. India are home.